In any line of work, there's going to be curveballs thrown every now and then, and today was one of those days. Cave-ins are somewhat common, especially in this time of year. In the last few months, we've had a couple of good rounds of snow and rain, and when the grave is opened up, sometimes that saturated ground doesn't hold up as well as it does in the drier season. I'm of the opinion that anytime we get the chance, we should set up the Wilbert way, with the vault suspended above the grave, so that when the family arrives to the cemetery, they were able to have their committal service and watch the vault be sealed and lowered if they so choose. In a lot of cases, we end up doing what's referred to as a false set, where the committal service is set up away from the grave, and at some point, the grave is dug out, and after the service has concluded, the casket will be lowered into the vault, and the vault will be lowered into the grave using the buggy. Thankfully today, I got a hold of the gravediggers, and they were just on the other side of town getting ready to dig a grave for the next day, and they offered to come on over and get this dug out. That way I could continue to set up my full Wilbert Way committal service. The gravediggers that dig at this cemetery also dig at dozens of other cemeteries in the area, and usually they're pretty reliable to get a hold of to get them to dig out the grave so we can still set a full graveside. Until they arrive, I'm going to go ahead and get started getting whatever I can get done before the grave is dug out. There's a decent amount of wind today, and I know a lot of rain is coming. So first things first, I can set my tent frame, minus one pole, that way it's not in the way of the digger when he gets here, and I can set up my walls to start blocking off that wind, and just do what I can to make this setup process shorter after I'm able to get back to work on the burial vault. I'm often asked how long this setup process takes, and the answer to that, it just varies in between a half an hour to 3 hours. It all depends on how far away from the road we are, what the weather is like, how many walls we have to put up, if we're fighting the wind, if the ground is saturated and we can't get our equipment next to the grave, and if we have to board in the buggy all the way from the road to the graveside to make sure we don't leave ruts. It can take far longer. But it's safe to say that in the summertime, when the ground is hard, it usually takes around 45 minutes to do a full setup. And in the wintertime, when we're 50 to 100 yards in from the road, it may take as much as 3 hours. Now, since we are a small company, we do need to give ourselves enough time to get help if anything goes wrong. So in general, we're given 3 hours to set up the funeral. So each funeral home gives us an ETA of about when they're going to arrive at the cemetery. Usually it's around 1 hour after the funeral has started at the funeral home or church. Now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get 3 hours of setup time when it only takes 45 minutes in most cases. But if the vault lid were to break, if the grave were to cave in, if there was a default on the vault itself, if anything breaks with our equipment, we need that time to have someone else arrive to the cemetery so that we can get the setup done properly and before they arrive at the cemetery. This particular cemetery is an hour and 42 minutes away from our shop. So, if anything goes wrong, we're going to be very tight on time to get it fixed. Once the gravediggers do arrive, it doesn't take long for them to clear off the dirt that's caved in from the vault next door, and then I'm ready to set up the Wilbert Monticello. Now, since it's caved off already, it would make sense to think that the grave is not safe to be around. But this is one of the reasons why I bring extra boards to the cemetery. Now, the side that caved in is underneath the dirt pile, so it makes sense as to why all that extra weight caused that wall to collapse. There was only around a foot worth of dirt until the next burial vault was placed in the ground. So the dirt between the burial vault and the open grave is what caved in, and the side that was towards the family did not appear to be loose or unstable. In these situations, I also use extra long wood boards, after of course taking a break to pet Runt, to support the weight of the vault out to the sides as much as possible to make sure too much pressure wasn't placed on the grave walls. If the grave would have caved towards the family, I would have adjusted my platform to set boards over that area to make sure that no one was walking on it, putting pressure on ground that's liable to collapse. Part of being a vault man is just using our better judgment to make sure that the family stays safe, but also doing everything we can to give the family the service that they deserve and the services they're expecting when they arrive to the cemetery. Of course, we want the family to be able to have the graveside at the location of where their loved one will be laid to rest, but safety is our number one concern. And if this was caved in on both sides and long boards didn't even help, if people were still going to be in places that were unstable, we would have done what's called a false setup to make sure that no one had the chance of falling or collapsing the grave and ending up getting hurt. So safety is our number one priority, but we also want to provide the service that the family is expecting. This portion of the video will be the process of setting our tent, setting our burial vault, using the Johnny Handler from True Rebel Equipment, and also preparing the graveside service with our chairs, our carpets, our chair covers, our banner, our nameplate and emblem, and towards the end of the video, I'll go into a little bit more detail about what happens at the end of the funeral process. Stay tuned. With the setup process now complete, I can go ahead and close off the front of the tent, trapping in all the heat from the heater until the family arrives. Now, it doesn't work that well on really windy days, but if you strap your tent down correctly and keep any of the air from coming in up against the wall that faces the wind, this heater can warm up the tent by about 20 to 30 degrees, and on a day like today, that's a big help for the family sitting underneath the tent. We just always have to watch out and make sure we let the preacher know that it's going to be hot right there and not to stand too close. I've seen a couple of pant legs melt over the years, so we do not want that to happen. At this time, the family has arrived, placed the casket onto the lowering device, and the committal service is taking place. For this service, the family moved on to the luncheon that was scheduled for after the committal service, which is fairly common in my area, although a lot of families do stay to watch the casket be lowered and the vault sealed and the vault lowered into the grave. In many cases, the families also stay and help backfill the grave. This part of the process is entirely up to the family members who are in attendance. When the family does move on to the luncheon, the funeral director and myself seal and lower the burial vault. In a lot of states, it is required that a funeral director be present until the vault is sealed, and in other states, the funeral director must be present until the vault is lowered and the cables removed. To seal and lower a burial vault, we begin by using the lowering device to lower the casket into the bottom of the vault. We can then add slack to the blue straps that support the casket and wiggle the straps out from each end of the vault. Wilbert burial vaults like this Wilbert Monticello have ridges that are poured into the bottom of the concrete vault that raise the ends of the caskets up around an inch off the base of the vault, allowing us to remove our straps. On concrete grave liners, metal inserts are inserted into the base of the grave liner to raise the casket up in the same way, and on metal lined burial vaults, like the Wilbert stainless steel triune, copper triune, and bronze triune, separate plastic inserts are placed in the bottom of the vault by the vault man before the family arrives, allowing the casket to be lifted up off the base of the copper, bronze, or stainless so that the casket straps can be removed. Now, before we can remove the lowering device from the rails, we need to remove the guide bars so that there is room to stand in the center of the lowering device. I prefer to remove the lowering device by myself. Oftentimes, there are gravediggers or funeral directors around who could help, but unfortunately, the way that the lowering device is set up, people have a tendency to lift up and pull back when lifting the lowering device off the rails, causing the person on the other end to fall forward. And I've seen people fall while carrying the lowering device when two people try to do it. And I've also had a cemetery worker pick up one end of the lowering device when I was attempting to remove it by myself. Now, when I lifted up, I was thinking that I would balance the lowering device, but since he lifted all the weight from behind me and I didn't see him, it launched me forward and my hand landed in between the lowering device, which landed on top of the rail. And I won't get too graphic, but it sheared the majority of the skin off my index finger straight to the bone. So personally, I prefer to remove this device by myself. It can be incredibly awkward, and it is probably one of the hardest steps for the new guys to get the hang of, is managing this lowering device from the truck to the graveside. The next step is why I prefer using the Wilbert way anytime that's possible. Suspending the vault over the grave makes it so that I can visually see around the entire edge of the vault. Wilbert burial vaults use an adhesive butyl seal in a tongue and groove fashion, with the base having the tongue and the lid having the groove. The seal is installed before the burial vault is even poured, and by suspending the vault in this way, I can look all the way around the entire edge of the vault to make sure that this lid sits perfectly aligned with the base. Once the base is raised into the lid, the seal disperses around the tongue of the base and adheres the lid to the base, giving this an air and watertight seal. Now, if the vault base were to be placed in the bottom of the grave and the lid were off to the side with chains attached to a backhoe or sitting on the buggy, when I went to seal that vault, there's a possibility that some dirt or debris had gotten onto the liner preventing a proper seal of the vault. So I prefer the Wilbert way in every circumstance where it's possible. It is a combination of the weight of the lid, which is around 1,200 pounds, pushing down onto the tongue of the base that disperses the seal around that tongue, but it's also the weight of the backfill dirt that is placed on top of the vault that presses the lid down and disperses the seal even farther. As you can tell, there is still a small gap in between the base and the lid where the liners meet. And if you watched my disinterment video that I showed the process of moving a vault across a cemetery, you can tell that the weight of that dirt compacted that lid down on top of the base, dispersing the seal farther. And that's exactly how this seal is designed to work. On the dozens of disinterments that I've been involved with, we can always tell if there's water on the interior of the vault. When we pick up the vault with our buggy using the harness, if there is water inside of the vault, it will shift to one end, causing one end of the vault to sit lower on the harness. That is one surefire way to tell, but another way to tell is when we do disinterments and the person is either placed in a mausoleum, placed in a new vault, or is being cremated. Obviously, we gain access to the interior of the vault, and most of the time that is done using a jackhammer of some kind or a concrete saw to be able to gain access to the vault, and every vault we've opened has been dry on the interior. And I know people will say that eventually the seal will fail, but Wilbert has a variety of warranties on these vaults, and that is the reason that they have a warranty that lasts only so long. After hundreds of years, there is nothing that will hold up against Mother Nature, and eventually everything goes back to the earth. But the burial vault itself does not stop the natural process of our loved ones returning back to the earth. Nothing stops us from returning to dust from which we came. Once the vault sits at the bottom of the grave, we can release the cables from one end and remove them from the other side. Oftentimes that means cranking the cables out because the small hooks on each end of the cable get caught on the edge of the burial vault. With the vault interred, the only thing left is to pack up all my equipment and head back to the shop to get ready for the next day's service. There is a lot of work that goes into setting a committal service, and sometimes family is only present for 10 minutes or less. I know for some people that doesn't make a lot of sense, but for me, it's perfectly fine. This is my job, and it's what I'm here to do. Even if it takes me 3 hours and a lot of manual labor to set this tent to shield the family from the elements, that is my job, and I was happy to make a comfortable setting for the family to lay their loved one to rest. It is an honor to do this type of work, and it is a job. Families do pay the funeral homes, and the funerals do pay my company, but it does have more of a rewarding feeling at times when I can help families grieve and make things, when it comes to the elements, a little bit easier on the families. There's not too many things in this world that are harder than losing a loved one or a family member or a friend. But one thing that I try to do is make sure that the family doesn't have any added stresses or worries when they're at the graveside, such as getting hurt, getting rained on, not being able to hear the preacher because of the wind, or getting sick from being out in the cold. My job is to just do my best to create a safe environment for the family. So, this video has been the process of dealing with a caved-in grave. Now, I wish every single cave-in was able to be sorted out in this manner so that the family could have a full, standard graveside setup. It is not always the case, and if you would like to see what happens when we place a false setup in the cemetery, feel free to find in the description below a few videos that I will link so you can see how other ways that this process is handled if we have a cave-in or a dangerous hillside setup. Thank you all for watching, and as always, take care and God bless.